Hello students, teachers, parents, history nerds, hello everybody, and welcome to Nutshelled History, where we lay out the facts, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We continue our American government series by looking at the Constitution. Don't forget that there's a link for a fill-in-the-blank worksheet in the description. I just ask that you like and subscribe. I apologize for any mispronunciations ahead of time. I do my best. The U.S. Constitution is like a blueprint for building a complicated government machine that actually works, most of the time. It starts with a fancy intro called the Preamble, followed by 7 articles, which are basically the government's instruction manual. Articles 1, 2, and 3 are where the magic happens. Article 1 gives us Congress, with 2 houses, like a weird political duplex. This 2-house setup was borrowed from the British, because who doesn't love a little old-school influence? Plus, it stops Congress from turning into an overgrown control freak. Article 2 creates the presidency, where one person gets to be in charge, until they're not. The president is basically the captain of this governmental ship, but with a lot more paperwork. Article 3 sets up the national courts, where lawyers duke it out to see who can best interpret the Constitution. There's the Supreme Court, where the big dogs rule, and then there are the lower courts, which are like the Constitution's little helpers. Now, the framers had 6 big ideas, kind of like the government's personality traits. Number 1, popular sovereignty. The government's power comes from the people, so if anyone asks, it's technically our fault. Number 2, limited government. The government is like a pet. It can only do what we tell it to. And no, it can't just do whatever it wants. Number 3, separation of powers. The government's power is split into 3 branches, so it's like a power pie divided into equal slices. Number 4, checks and balances. Each branch of government gets to play watchdog over the others. It's like a game of political rock, paper, scissors. Number 5, judicial review. The courts have superpowers to declare things unconstitutional, like an official nope button. Number 6, federalism. Power is divided between the national government and the states, like siblings forced to share the same room, but with different chores. Okay. Now, so the Constitution is essentially a rule book designed to keep things in check, make sure no one gets too bossy, and remind everyone that even the government has to play by the rules. The Constitution is like that classic recipe that's been in the family for over 200 years. Still delicious, but with a few updates or amendments to keep it fresh. Some ingredients, words, have been swapped, some have been added, and others have been tossed out like expired milk. This recipe can be tweaked in 2 ways. The formal method, following the instructions to the letter, and the informal method, adding a little spice here and there without touching the recipe card. The formal way is like getting approval from the whole family before changing the recipe. First, someone proposes an update at the national level, probably that one relative who thinks they're a chef. Then, all the states have to give it a thumbs up, either by legislature or state conventions. This is the go-to method for almost all of the 27 changes we've made so far. If a state says no, don't worry, they can always come back later and change their mind. But like all good things, you've got a time limit, usually around 7 years, before your chance to amend expires. The first 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were added back in 1789 because people weren't about to sign on unless the federal government promised to keep its hands off their basic rights. Since then, we've tacked on 17 more, one by one, like patches on an old quilt. Now, informal changes? They're like those secret tweaks that don't officially alter the recipe but change the flavor. There are 5 main sources for these. 1. Congress. These guys have whipped up thousands of laws, some to explain the Constitution, and others to fill in the gaps on how to run the kitchen, i.e., the government. 2. The presidents. They've added their own flair, like making executive agreements, handshake deals with other countries, instead of treaties that need Congress's approval. 3. The courts, especially the Supreme Court, which is like the ultimate food critic. They interpret the recipe, decide if government actions pass the taste test, and sometimes even redefine key ingredients. 4. Political parties. These party planners have changed how things work, especially by making the Electoral College, the group that formally picks the president, less relevant than it used to be. 5. Customs. These are like kitchen traditions that aren't written down but everyone follows. For example, the president's cabinet, the squad of department heads, isn't in the Constitution, but it's always been a thing. Same goes for senatorial courtesy, where the Senate lets certain senators have the final say on local presidential appointments. So the Constitution is like a flexible, evolving recipe that adapts to changing tastes, but still keeps the core flavor intact. Now, let's focus on one of those principles from before: federalism. Federalism is like a power-sharing arrangement between the national government and the states, where both get to boss people around, but in different areas. It's like a constitutional tug-of-war, and somehow they both win, mostly. The national government gets the fancy delegated powers, which are basically the VIP passes of government authority. These powers are split into 3 categories. 1, expressed powers, the ones that are spelled out clearly in the Constitution, like the national government's ultimate to-do list. 2, implied powers. These are the "I'm just gonna do this because it seems like a good idea" powers, hinted at but not directly written down. 3, inherent powers. These are the "we've always done it this way" powers, like regulating immigration, because every national government needs a few go-to moves. But hey, even the national government doesn't get a blank check. The Constitution steps in with a big nope in 3 ways. Either by saying it out loud, by staying silent, which in government speak means not allowed, or because it would mess up the whole federal system if they tried. On the flip side, the states get reserved powers, which are basically everything that's left over, like deciding how old you have to be to drive without crashing into things. But just like the national government, the states also have some limits on their power because the Constitution isn't handing out free passes. Now, most of the national government's powers are exclusive, meaning the states can't touch them. But there's a batch of shared powers called concurrent powers, which means both levels of government get to play with them, like 2 siblings sharing the same toys, hopefully without fighting too much. When things get messy and the national government and the states start stepping on each other's toes, the Supreme Court steps in as the ultimate referee. They get to throw the Constitution's Supremacy Clause flag, reminding everyone that the Constitution is the big boss, the supreme law of the land. And yes, that means even the national government has to listen. The Constitution basically tells the national government to act like a protective big sibling. It promises to make sure each state has a republican form of government, so no shenanigans allowed, and that it'll step in to protect the states from invaders and from people causing a ruckus at home. If things get too wild or there's a disaster, federal officials can roll in to save the day. The national government also has the power to create new states, but there's a catch. You can't just chop up an existing state without getting permission from its legislature, because that would be rude. To join the club, an area needs to ask Congress nicely. Congress gives them the green light to write a state constitution, and once that's approved, the president signs off, and voila, a new state is born. The national and state governments are like roommates who help each other out, often through different types of grants. These grants are like funding allowances for specific broad or project-based things. In return, the states do stuff for the national government, like paying for and running national elections, because who doesn't love extra work? Back in the day, states weren't the best at getting along, which is partly why the Constitution exists. Now, they can't make treaties with each other, but they can sign agreements called interstate compacts when they need to solve common problems together. The full faith and credit clause is like the Constitution's version of what's yours is mine. States have to respect each other's laws, records, and court decisions, at least when it comes to civil matters. Criminal stuff? That's a whole different ballgame. Extradition is another feature where, if you commit a crime in one state and flee to another, they'll send you back faster than you can say, "It wasn't me." And finally, the Privileges and Immunities Clause ensures that a New Yorker visiting Florida can't be treated like an alien from another planet. Each state has to let other Americans do their thing within its borders, but they can still set some rules, like making sure you've been around long enough before you can vote. In short, the Constitution's interstate relations rules are like peacekeepers. making sure the states stay in their lanes and play nice with each other while keeping the national government in the driver's seat. Now, a quick recap. The U.S. Constitution is like a 200-year-old recipe that still works, keeping the government machine running with a few updates. It's built on 6 core ideas: popular sovereignty, limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances, judicial review, and federalism. These ideas divide power between the people, the national government, and the states, with Congress, the president, and the courts each having distinct roles. The Constitution evolves through formal amendments and informal changes, adapting to new challenges. Federalism ensures a balance between national and state powers, while rules like interstate relations keep things civil between states, all under the Constitution's supreme authority. There you have it, folks. That is the Constitution nutshelled. Thanks for stopping by Nutshelled History. Please formally amend Nutshelled History by adding to the subscriber and like count, and informally amend this video with some nice comments. See y'all next time on Nutshelled History.